There is a moment in every great career of reinvention when the person doing the reinventing understands, for the first time, the full scale of what they have become. For Diana, that moment came in February 1992 in a hospital ward in Lahore, Pakistan. She had come alone, or as alone as she was ever permitted to be, which meant a small security detail, a private secretary, and a photographer she had approved. No press scrum, no official delegation. She had asked to come quietly, and the request had been granted with a slight surprise that always accompanied her requests for quiet, because quiet was not what Diana was supposed to be. She walked into the children's cancer ward and sat down on a bed next to a boy who was 4 years old and who had been told, in the way that very ill children are sometimes told, that a special visitor was coming. He did not know who she was. He was 4. He was wearing a small hospital gown, and he had the particular translucent quality of a very sick child, the skin showing what it should not show. She sat down, she took his hand, she talked to him for 40 minutes. There was a photograph taken of that moment, the one she had approved the photographer for, and it ran in newspapers across the world. Not because it was a staged image of a princess performing charity, though some people read it that way, but because something in the photograph was unmistakably real. The quality of her attention, the way her body was oriented entirely toward the child, the absence of performance. The photograph ran in every major newspaper in the world, and something that had been building for a decade became, in that moment, undeniable. Diana Spencer had walked into the most photographed institution in the world as a shy 20-year-old who worked part-time in a nursery school and didn't know what to do with her hands at formal dinners. By 1992, she had become the most recognized face on the planet, not through the machinery of royal protocol or the management of image consultants, though there was some of that, but through something more fundamental, through the specific, unusual quality of her attention, through the discovery, made gradually and at great personal cost, of what she was actually for. This is the story of that discovery. She was born Diana Frances Spencer on the 1st of July, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham Estate in Norfolk. The house was leased from the Queen. Her father, John Spencer, was an equerry to the royal family. Her mother, Frances, was 25 years old and had already lost one child, a son born prematurely who had lived only 10 hours. The birth of Diana was followed 18 months later by the birth of Charles, the son the family had been hoping for, which meant that Diana's early life had the particular quality of a child born into an expectation and then adjacent to its fulfillment. She has spoken about this, not extensively, and not in a way that was self-pitying, but clearly enough to understand it. She was the 4th child, the 3rd daughter, born into a family that needed something else. This is not an unusual position for a child to be in. Many children are born into expectations they don't quite meet. What it produces, when it is not compensated for by attention of other kinds, is a specific way of moving through the world, always slightly to the side of the room, always watching for the thing that will make you the right thing after all, always adjusting your position in response to cues that other people might not even notice. Diana noticed everything. Her parents' marriage ended when she was 6. Her mother left the house, left Norfolk, eventually left England, moved to Scotland, and then to Paris with the man she had fallen in love with. The custody battle that followed was, by all accounts, bitter in the particular way that custody battles are bitter when the children are the territory being contested. Diana was 7 years old when the courts decided, and the decision was not in her mother's favor. She stayed with her father. She saw her mother at intervals that were arranged and sometimes rearranged, and always, in the way of arranged intervals, not quite what either party needed. She learned in those years to read rooms, to read the temperature of a situation before she entered it, to understand what was wanted from her and to decide, quickly and accurately, whether to provide it. This is a skill that children develop when their environment is unpredictable, when the adults around them are sometimes present and sometimes not, when the emotional weather of the house changes without announcement. It is not a comfortable skill to have. But it is an extraordinarily useful one, and Diana had it to a degree that the people who worked with her later in life described as almost supernatural. She could walk into a ward of patients, a room of strangers, a crowd of thousands, and understand within seconds who needed what, who was frightened, who was performing courage they didn't feel, who needed to be touched, and who needed to be left with their dignity intact. She did not learn this in any school or from any teacher. She learnt it on the floors of the houses of her childhood, reading the silences between adults and understanding what they meant. She was 19 years old when she met the man she would marry. Charles Philip Arthur George, Prince of Wales, was 31. The gap was 12 years in age and approximately 40 years in terms of institutional formation. Charles had been prepared from birth for a specific role in a specific institution, and that preparation had shaped him in the deep ways that thoroughgoing preparation always shapes a person. He was thoughtful, principled, interested in ideas, and profoundly constrained by the expectations of the life he had been born into. He was also, by his own later account, and the accounts of people who knew him well, someone who did not find emotional intimacy easy. Diana, who found emotional intimacy the most natural thing in the world, did not see this initially. She saw a man who was kind to her, who was interested in her, who was choosing her from among the options available to a Prince of Wales. She was 19. She had not been chosen in the specific sense by very many people. She said yes. The wedding was on the 29th of July, 1981. 750 million people watched it on television. She wore a dress with a 25-foot train designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, and she walked up the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral on her father's arm with the expression of someone who understands that something enormous is happening and has decided to be equal to it. She was 20 years old. The early years of the marriage were the years in which Diana understood, gradually and then all at once, the shape of the life she had entered. It was a life of structure so complete that it left no room for the self that hadn't been planned for. There was a schedule, there was protocol. There was a correct way to stand, and a correct way to sit, and a correct way to shake hands, and a correct way to smile, and a correct time length for the smile, and a correct distance to maintain from the person being smiled at. There were ladies in waiting, and private secretaries and equerries and protection officers, and press secretaries, all of them functioning as the machinery of a role that existed before Diana arrived and would exist after she left. Into this machinery, Diana was introduced as the new component. She did not fit, not because she was rebellious, or not primarily because of that. She did not fit because the machinery had no space for the thing she actually was, someone with an enormous internal life, with a specific gift for connection, with a kind of emotional intelligence that the institution neither recognized nor had any use for. The palace wanted a Princess of Wales who was decorative, dependable, and discreet. Diana was all of these things in the wrong way, and not these things in the right way. She was lonely in a manner that she found difficult to articulate at the time, partly because she lacked the vocabulary, and partly because the loneliness was structural. It was built into the architecture of the life itself. You cannot be lonely in an empty room. You can be lonely in a room full of people who are performing relationship with you, rather than having it. Diana was always in the second kind of room. She ate badly. She struggled with bulimia in those years, a fact she discussed later with the specific precision of someone who had worked out what it meant, that the control over what went into her body was the only control available to her in a life in which almost nothing else was within her agency. She has described this not as weakness, but as logical response. Given what she had, she did what made sense. The sense it made was the wrong kind of sense. But the logic was real. She was 21, 22, 23. The transformation did not happen in a single moment. It happened the way most real changes happen, incrementally, accumulating, until the day you look back and understand that the person you are now is not the person you were, and the distance between the two is so large it takes your breath away. The early sign of what she would become was visible if you knew to look for it, in the photographs from her first public engagements. The shyness was real, the downcast look, the uncertain smile, the slight hunch of the shoulders that physical, very tall people sometimes develop as children when they feel conspicuous. She was not performing the shyness. She was shy, but there was something else visible in the same photographs, something that existed alongside the shyness and would eventually replace it. When she was talking to someone, actually talking, one-to-one, rather than performing the official greeting, her attention shifted. The uncertainty went somewhere. She was entirely present. Whatever the other person was saying, she was receiving it fully, not waiting for her turn to speak, not scanning the room for the next obligation, but actually there. The people she spoke to noticed this. They noticed it in a way that was unusual because they were accustomed at royal events to conversations that were a particular kind of managed, brief, pleasant, unmemorable, the experience of being acknowledged rather than known. Diana gave people the experience of being known. In 3 minutes in a receiving line, she could make a person feel that they were the only person in the room. This is not a technique. You cannot be trained to do this. You either have the quality of attention that makes it possible or you don't. Diana had it in a quantity that most people, most very good, very caring people, do not have. She began to understand this about herself somewhere in the mid-1980s. She began to understand that the things she had, which the palace neither recognized nor valued, was in fact the most powerful thing available to her. That in a world of managed image and careful distance, the offer of genuine presence was extraordinary. That she could walk into any room in the world and the room would change. The question was what to do with it. She chose her charities the way a person chooses what to do with a gift they've discovered they have. Not strategically at first, not with a master plan, but with instinct. She went to the places she felt drawn to. She stayed in them long enough to understand them. The work with leprosy patients began in 1984. This matters as a detail not because leprosy is a particularly common cause for a royal to champion, but because of what leprosy meant, symbolically and practically, in 1984. Leprosy was among the most stigmatized of diseases. It was associated with contagion in a way that was largely medically inaccurate. Leprosy is one of the least contagious diseases in existence, but powerfully socially operative. People with leprosy were not touched. The social and physical fact of not being touched was, in many places where Diana worked on this issue, the primary experience of the disease for the people who had it. She was photographed shaking hands with a leprosy patient in a hospital in Indonesia. No gloves. The photograph ran everywhere. The point was understood immediately, which was that the person who had been making the decision not to shake hands was not the patient, but the visitor, and the decision communicated what it communicated. She did the same with AIDS patients 2 years later. This was 1987. The AIDS crisis was at the peak of its horror and the peak of its misunderstanding. The disease was associated in the public mind with categories of people who had been judged deserving of it, which is among the most destructive things a society can decide about an illness, and the practical consequence of this judgment was that people with AIDS were among the most isolated people in any room they occupied. Diana walked into the first purpose-built AIDS ward in Britain and shook hands without gloves with the patients there. She sat with them. She talked to them. The cameras recorded it, and the record served its purpose. The question of whether it was safe to touch a person with AIDS was answered by the image of the Princess of Wales doing it without apparent concern. She was asked later whether she had been aware of the symbolic weight of the gesture. She said yes. She said she had known exactly what she was doing. She said she had also just wanted to meet them. Both things were true, and their being simultaneously true was the source of her power. The symbolic calculation was real and conscious, and so was the genuine desire to be in the room with the person in front of her. She was not performing presence while calculating effect. She was present, and the presence was the effect. The fashion is impossible to separate from the story, and it would be dishonest to try. Diana understood clothes in the way that some people understand music or language, as a form of communication with its own grammar, its own capacity for precision. She knew what a dress said. She knew what a hat said, what the absence of a hat said, what color communicated and what cut communicated, and what the decision to repeat an outfit or to debut a new one on a particular occasion communicated to the people looking. This knowledge was not innate. She developed it in the years of her marriage, partly through the guidance of people who knew the language of fashion at its highest level, and partly through the specific education of being photographed constantly, of seeing herself as others saw her, and understanding what the image was saying versus what she had intended. Catherine Walker, who dressed her for many of the most significant events of her public life, has spoken about what it was like to work with her. She describes a woman who was not interested in fashion as an end, who was not a collector of clothes or a performer of consumption, but who understood clothes as tools, who arrived at fittings with a specific intention for the event she was dressing for, and wanted to know whether the dress would serve that intention. The black dress she wore to the Serpentine Gallery in June 1994, the night Charles's documentary interview about the breakdown of the marriage was broadcast, has been analyzed more than almost any other single garment in the history of public dressing. She chose it after knowing the interview was going to air that evening. She went out anyway. She wore a short off-the-shoulder black dress that was not the kind of thing she usually wore to such events. She looked extraordinary. She smiled for the cameras. The image that resulted was one of the most powerful images of the entire divorce era, not the image of a woman diminished, but the image of a woman who had decided something. She had decided something. The humanitarian work that defined the last years of her life had been building for a decade before the landmine campaign. But the landmine campaign was where it became something qualitatively different. She had been involved with the Red Cross since 1996, when her divorce was finalized, and she began, quietly and with the specific clarity of someone who has been freed from an obligation they had been meeting for 15 years, to think about what she wanted to do with the platform she had. Not the institutional platform that had been substantially diminished by the divorce, which had removed her HRH status and repositioned her outside the formal structure of the royal family, but the actual platform, the thing that was hers regardless of titles. The actual platform was enormous. She was the most photographed person in the world. Wherever she went, cameras followed. Whatever she touched became visible. She decided to touch landmines. The international campaign to ban landmines was not, in early 1997, a mainstream cause. It was a cause that had been championed by NGOs and activists and a relatively small number of politicians, largely outside the attention of the general public, largely because landmines are a problem that exists at significant geographical and psychological distance from the populations, with the most media power. They are buried in the ground in Angola and Cambodia and Bosnia and Mozambique, and they kill and maim people who are mostly poor and mostly far away. And the distance is the problem. Diana solved the distance problem by collapsing it. She went to Angola in January 1997. She walked through a partially cleared minefield, a fact that the palace and the British government found alarming enough to produce public statements about, statements which she ignored, in a flak jacket and protective mask, visually indistinguishable from the demining workers except for the fact that she was internationally recognizable. She met the survivors. She sat with the woman who had lost both legs to a landmine and held her hand for a long time and talked to her with the quality of attention that she had been bringing to these encounters for 15 years. The photographs ran everywhere. The coverage was substantial. The political response was substantial. Politicians who had been carefully managing their distance from the landmine issue found that distance suddenly difficult to maintain. William Hague, the Conservative leader, made a statement suggesting that Diana was a naive trespasser on complex political territory. She responded, briefly and without apparent rancor, that she was a humanitarian rather than a politician, and that if being concerned about civilians losing their limbs to weapons that continued to kill long after wars ended was naive, she was comfortable with naivete. The Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel landmines was signed in December 1997 by 122 countries. Diana had died 4 months earlier. The people who worked on the campaign have said, with care and with specificity, that they do not attribute the treaty solely to her involvement. The groundwork had been laid by a decade of advocacy by organizations and individuals who had no cameras following them and no platform of the kind she had, but they are equally clear that her involvement changed the trajectory, that the visibility she brought to the issue, and the specific quality of that visibility, not the celebrity drop-in but the sustained engagement, the second trip, the willingness to sit with survivors for as long as they needed, the refusal to perform concern rather than actually feeling it, moved things at a speed that would not otherwise have been possible. There are images from the last year of her life that are different in quality from the images of the decade before. Partly, this is the objective fact that she was 35, 36, a woman rather than the girl who had walked into the palace at 20 and spent the next decade becoming someone. The face had settled. The uncertainty that had been visible in the early photographs was gone, replaced by something that is hard to name precisely. Composure is the wrong word because it implies management of feeling, and what she had achieved was not the management of feeling but the integration of it. She had learned to hold all of it and still be present. She was photographed in Angola, walking through the cleared minefield, in the flak jacket and protective gear, in the flat midday light that does no favors to anyone. She was laughing at something one of the demining workers had said. The laugh was real. The demining workers around her were laughing too, which meant she had said something rather than someone saying something at her. She was in the scene, not visiting it. She was photographed in June 1997 at a Christie's auction of her dresses, 79 gowns, selected by Diana, auctioned to raise money for AIDS charities and cancer charities. She sat in the front row and watched the bidding with the expression of someone who is enjoying themselves. The dresses sold for $3.5 million. She was photographed in Sarajevo in August 1997, 3 weeks before she died, kneeling on the ground beside a young woman who had stepped on a landmine. The young woman had lost part of her leg. She was 20. Diana was holding her hand and looking at her with the full focus attention, the particular quality of being seen that Diana gave to the people she sat with. The young woman was looking back at her. The photograph ran the next day. Then, in the way of photographs, It was replaced by other photographs, and those by others, and the accumulation of images became the story of a week and then a month, and then a year. She died on the 31st of August 1997 in the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital in Paris. She was 36 years old. The days that followed produced one of the most significant collective grief responses in modern British history, which people have spent the decades since trying to understand. The flowers piled outside Kensington Palace, the queues that stretched for miles, the books of condolences that required coordination to manage, the silence in the streets on the morning of the funeral that was, by account after account, the thing people remembered most. A silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something. Some people have analyzed this response as a kind of mass projection. The public mourning, not a real person, but an image, a symbol, a screen onto which they had projected their own needs and losses and frustrations with the institution she represented and sometimes challenged. There is something to this analysis. Public grief is always partly about the person being grieved and partly about the griever. This is true at every scale, but the analysis undersells something. The people who stood in those queues were not primarily people who had stood in other queues for other famous deaths. They were not primarily people who had lost a celebrity. Many of them had met her briefly in a receiving line, at a hospital visit, at a charity event, or knew someone who had. And the quality they described, when they were interviewed about why they had come and what they were mourning, was consistent across thousands of different people in different places who had had different experiences of her. They said she had made them feel seen, not as a mass, not as the crowd, as a person, as a specific individual who was standing in front of her, with whatever that individual was carrying and who was received fully. This is a rare quality. It is rarer than beauty or charisma or eloquence, though Diana had elements of all of those. It is the quality of genuine attention, and the reason it moves people so completely is that it is so seldom available. Most of us move through most of our lives being partially seen by most of the people we encounter. We edit ourselves for legibility. We perform the version of ourselves that is socially functional. We are known in fragments. This fragment by this person, that fragment by that one. And the experience of being known whole is something many people have almost never had. Diana offered it. In a receiving line. In a hospital ward. In a minefield. She offered it, and it was real. And the people who received it understood that it was real, and some of them never forgot it. There is a thing that happens sometimes in lives that are both very public and very short. The life gets organized by its ending in a way that the person living it could not have planned and did not plan. Diana did not die at 36 as part of a trajectory. She died in the middle of something. The landmine campaign was ongoing. There were trips planned. There were conversations in progress that were never finished. Relationships that had been begun and not yet resolved. Work that had been started and not yet completed. She was not a finished story when she died. She was a continuing one. This is part of why the image of her has proved so durable, not because the story concluded cleanly, but because it didn't. Because there is a permanent open question at the center of it. What would she have done with the rest of her life? The platform she had, the skill she had developed, the specific gift of her attention applied to the scale of her visibility. Where would it have gone? The landmine campaign gives some indication. She had understood by the last year of her life that the combination of her presence and the presence of a camera could move political mountains that policy and advocacy alone could not move, and she had begun to use this understanding systematically. She was not approaching the causes she championed as a celebrity visitor. She was approaching them as someone who had something specific to offer and who wanted to offer it most effectively. The people who worked with her in those last months described someone who was asking questions that were more sophisticated than the questions she had asked earlier in her career. Not just where are the people who need to be seen, but what would it actually take to change this? What is the specific point of intervention? Where does the camera need to be, and who does it need to show? She was becoming, at 36, the thing she had been moving toward for 15 years. Not a figurehead, but an actor. Not a symbol, but a force. The loss is in the not knowing what that force would have become. What remains is the images. There are more photographs of Diana than of almost any other individual of her era. They were taken, most of them, without her permission, and many of them against her explicit wishes, by people whose professional interest in her image was not aligned with her own interest in how she was seen. The relationship between Diana and the press was one of the defining conflicts of her public life, and it was not a conflict she won. And yet the images that have lasted, the ones that mean something, The ones that are reproduced and referenced and returned to are not primarily the stolen ones. They are the images from the hospital wards and the minefields and the hospices and the charity events. They are the images in which she is fully present, looking at someone, holding someone's hand, laughing at something real, the images of her attention. This is the paradox at the center of the story of Diana's public life. The most photographed woman in the world was at her most powerful when she forgot the camera was there, when she was entirely in the scene rather than performing the scene. When the quality of attention she had developed across a childhood of reading rooms and a decade of learning what she was for was directed entirely at the person in front of her, and the camera recorded something it hadn't been asked to record. The genuineness is the thing. It was always the thing. She was born into a world that required performance. She performed. She was also, underneath the performance, entirely real. And the realness, when it was visible, when it broke through the protocol and the managed image, and the institutional management of who she was supposed to be, is what moves people still. She was 36 years old. She had been figuring out what she was for. She had figured it out.